Perfect. Paul, you good to go?
Great. All right. So, welcome everybody. My name is Paul Darvazi, and I'm going to be discussing how games for conflict resolution, simulations that explore power, peace, and perspective. And I'll explain a little bit where this research was grounded, a bit about my background, give you some very concrete examples of both the methodologies and theories at play, but also how they apply to a variety of different games, many who that are very probably more relevant today than when I first started going down this trail a number of years ago. And we will have time at the end to answer some questions. So, a little bit about me. My name is Paul Darvazi. I teach at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Education. I specialize in games and learning. I also teach educational technology, social media, and education. But that is my side hustle. The two things that take up most of my time is that I run a studio called Goldbug Interactive. It's a serious game studio. We create games, animation, and media for the United Nations, for German development agencies. And my favorite client is that we make games for Fred Rogers. Some of you may know Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or Alma's Way or Daniel Tiger. So that's a lot of fun. And the third thing that I do is I run the Serious Play Conference, a conference that's been around for 18 years, focusing on serious games and all the sort of wide applications of game simulations for learning, training, and social mobilization. My team took the conference over 3 years ago. And we've been working very hard to sort of level it up in a number of ways. This year, we are hosting it at Duke University in North Carolina in early August. And we are also inaugurating our first Serious Play Europe, which will be in June in Mainz, Germany. It's an incredible event, and I would encourage you to come if you have any interest in the area of using games for all sorts of interesting purposes. So, the origin story of this project started with a United Nations white paper that I wrote for the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. They're a Delhi-based UN organization who've done a ton of work around games and learning, games and education, a series of deployments largely taking place in Southeast Asia. And they commissioned the writing of a paper which received quite a bit of international attention when I did write it and publish it. I remember I was interviewed by the BBC and the CBC, and everybody was really excited that the UN was starting to use video games. So it was really, really exciting. And what it was, in many ways, the paper, when you're thinking about commercial video games through the lens of peace and conflict resolution, I think part of the attention that it received was because it's diametrically opposed by popular conceptions of games being violent and antisocial and causing social harm. When we think of a video game, where the general public thinks of a video game, they think of something like this. And as a result, to think that we could leverage these games not for violence, but for the possibility of conflict resolution and peace really countered this dominant narrative. And one of the reasons that thinking about games in this way is possible is, as many of you who know the game world realize, that there's been sort of a twin revolution in games. 15 or 20 years ago, if you wanted to buy a video game, you had to go to a store, and you'd buy a box and bring it home and download the CDs onto your computer. And many of these games were made by studios with a ton of money who could afford the teams and the crews to make them worthy of commercialization and commercial success or market success. So what happened was, one, the widespread availability of game development engines like Unity that encouraged the rise of independent game makers who would be able to create a pretty decent video game or digital game in their basement. And the other part of the formula was the advent of online digital market platforms, most famously Steam, that allowed independent producers to make their games available to the public. And what it started happening was there was increasingly an enormous diversity in the types of games that were being produced and played. Rather than, the AAA studios tend to be beholden to the market, don't like to deviate from their formulas, but independent game makers tend to be more experimental and explore all types of things with games. So we started seeing the rise of what we call serious games now, or games for change, or transformative games, either intentionally with pro-social purposes or unintentionally with pro-social purposes that gave us more to draw from when thinking about using games for positive outcomes. So a little bit about conflict resolution. So peace education is the process of acquiring the values, the knowledge, and developing the attitudes, skills, and behaviors to live in harmony with oneself and others and with the natural environment. So it's not just about, resolving a war. Peace education focuses a lot on harmonizing ourselves with the world around us, with people around us on an interpersonal level as well, obviously, as on a national and global level. Conflict resolution is the way for two or more parties to find a peaceful solution to a disagreement. The disagreement may be personal, financial, political, or emotional. Conflict is central to human existence. There's an argument that every moment of our life is a conflict as we're negotiating an objective reality from our subjective selves. That's the reason why any narrative, regardless if it's a myth, a story, folklore, a video game, a novel, is driven by conflict because it reflects the reality that we are, arguably in perpetual conflict and negotiating conflict. And there's sort of more manageable levels of conflict, but then sometimes they flare up into something which becomes unpleasant or potentially damaging. And there are very deliberate strategies that can be used to diffuse or dissolve conflict. And that is all within the realm of conflict resolution. So when you're thinking about peace, and you're thinking about what are some of the ingredients or sort of the recipe to reduce conflict and move towards a peaceful state. One is intergroup contact. The second is perspective taking. Empathy is very, very important because then we can put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, to use the probably the most worn out way of describing empathy. Intercultural understanding is particularly useful when we're thinking internationally or interculturally. Understanding complicity. What is our role in this conflict? How are we contributing to the, this potentially damaging situation? So I'd like to begin with the idea of contact. And I think what I like about this is it's very, very practical. I think anybody on this call could benefit from this little tidbit. It's not just something we think about in a geopolitical perspective, but also very much on an interpersonal perspective. So when we're thinking about contact, we as human beings have the habit of blowing things out of proportion when we don't have immediate contact with an aggravating party. So let's say you have a relative whom you have some kind of conflict with or a disagreement with, and you don't see them for a very long period of time. Well, over that time, in your mind, that sort of dislike or hatred, if I would go to that far, starts mutating them into something which is one to the exclusion of some of the more beneficial elements of their personality, because even some of the worst people tend to have redeeming aspects to their personality. And also it can become very disproportionate. And what you find is when you actually have contact, you meet and engage with this person, it grounds you in the reality of who they are and mitigates some of your worst thoughts around them. So contact on an interpersonal level is very important. And the same principle applies when you expand that to a geopolitical perspective. So what happens when you don't have contact? Well, it aggravates biases and prejudices. It dehumanizes the other, whether it's another culture, another person, another nation. Um, it diminishes our ability to have compassion and empathy, again, by seeing somebody, by seeing their expression, by being in the presence of the nuances of who they are. That certainly can nourish our empathy and allow us to more clearly place ourselves in their mindset. But when you don't have contact, the opposite is true. And the lack of contact also absolves us or can absolve us in our complicity in the broken relationship. What have we done to contribute to this? Because we're always focused on, what the other person has done to us, and sometimes that might blind us from what perhaps we have contributed to that relationship. It also emphasizes differences. When we sort of internalize somebody in the abstract, especially through a dark or negative lens, we can really focus on what's different, or othering the person. Whereas when we are in contact with them, that tends to diminish. So that when we have contact, it reduces bias and prejudice. It can humanize or help humanize the other. It occasions empathy and compassion. It allows us to acknowledge our complicity, or at least the opportunity to acknowledge our complicity, and it certainly can help us emphasize commonality. So, contact is very important when we are thinking about peaceful resolutions. The problem is, though, is getting people to the table, because we are often reluctant to make contact, physical contact, with somebody whom we dislike or whom we have a protracted conflict with. We not only see this again at the interpersonal level, but the first step to a negotiation process when you have an international conflict is getting the people to the table. And sometimes there's even an unwillingness to bring somebody to the table. So there's been a lot of work on a process of approximation that could begin with virtual peace education. What this does is it says, well, if you can't physically bring people to the table, you can, because intergroup contact during active and violent conflict can be impossible to implement, you can have them meet through a virtually mitigated environment. That doesn't literally mean virtual reality. It could be a chat, it could be a video conference, something that creates just enough distance that makes allowances for somebody to be more willing to create contact, and then maybe start a process that will engage them in more direct and physical contact. And even the virtual studies have found that even this sort of virtual meeting can create positive and healthy resolution. So what this is our first step into what games can do, or what as a site of social interaction and virtual contact, because games do allow us to meet in virtual environments and to engage and collaborate and work together in virtual environments. And it's fascinating that studies have found that when you have uh, individuals who come from cultures or nations or in conflict, and they collaborate together in a virtual environment, there is a very positive result shown in how they feel about each other and how they think about each other. And surprisingly, this also includes engaging in violent games together. So if you're on the same team in Fortnite or Call of Duty or Battleground, and you're working together and working as a team and feeling that connection, they've done this with Israeli and Palestinian kids, for example, their perception of each other significantly improves. And this is always a good moment to add that a lot of studies have shown, well, at least one has shown that what the perception that violent games, so shooting games or war games, produces violent behavior is in fact a misconception because the violent content itself doesn't produce an aggressive behavior. What they found is it's competitive games that can produce aggressive feelings after the game is over. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you watch sports, sports can be very aggressive. Competition can be frustrating. It raises our temperatures. And so what they found is, for example, sports games can lead to more aggression than violent games where you don't feel necessarily that kind of competitiveness, which is usually more accentuated when you are playing against what you perceive to be live players. So player versus player environments versus PvE, which is player versus environment type games. And what is found to be, not surprisingly, one of the key drivers in successful conflict resolution and obviously towards harmonizing towards a process of peace is empathy. Because what that does is it allows us to position ourselves in such a way that we allow, we think about the other person in the conflict, and we think about what it's like to be standing there and what circumstances have brought them into conflict with us. The French have a saying that I love, which is to understand everything is to forgive everything. That sometimes our conflicts are really generated, either from greed or resources or something, something more objective, but often it's also just a lack of understanding of the unique contexts and circumstances of the other individual. So the more we understand about that, the more likely we are to arrive at a peaceful evolution. This is one of many definitions. It's just something workable for our purposes today of empathy. This is by Alfred Adler. Empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another. Basically, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. So, when we are thinking about empathy, one important aspect of it is perspective taking, sort of putting yourself into somebody else's perspective. And this occasions a thought about what narrative perspectives are. And this is en route to thinking about how games inhere or operate. So anybody who's taken an English class or a literature class has learned that we have the first person perspective, and this manifests itself, in games, in videos, and it's all sort of coming through the eyes of the person who is, central to the narrative. The second perspective, person perspective, one of the rare ones is the you perspective. We see this in the game world. We see this often in text-based games. You enter the room, you see a light, and where they address you in the you voice. It's very rare in the literary world, for one, and even in the game world. Third person perspective is when we see the other, when we are standing back and experiencing how the other is behaving sort of in front of us. We may be a fly on the wall, or we may be in the room as somebody else. And then finally, the third person omniscient is, this godlike perspective where you're taking a wide view of all the things that are going on between you. And what's really fascinating is all of these perspectives play out in the game world, that there are games that take on all these various perspectives. So let's look at the first person perspective. This is a game called BioShock. And in BioShock, as in many first-person shooters, you are inhabiting the body of the main character. You're looking at the world through their eyes. And what I would have thought, without any research, is that this would be the one that would create the greatest empathy, because you are literally embodying the mind and the body of the other. But what the literature has found and research has found is that this is the one that is the least empathetic, because there's no emotional distance between you and the player. It's basically a version of yourself. And therefore, it is not necessarily conducive, at least in some research, towards empathy, which is very counterintuitive, from my perspective. Then we have the second person perspective. This is Depression Quest. Some of you may know it. It's one of it's a very, very powerful game by Zoe Quinn that delves into what it's like to live with depression and anxiety. It's a text-based game. It's relayed in the second person perspective, and it does evoke a great deal of empathy. I mean, this in the textual mode really kind of takes you into the frustrations and limitations and that it is to live with anxiety and depression. You may or may not know that it wasn't this game, but Zoe Quinn was kind of the trigger for what was known as Gamergate, one of the darkest chapters in recent gaming history. I'm not going to get into it, but you might want to look it up if you want to know more about that. Now, the third person perspective is typically understood to be the one that creates the most empathy. So you're standing back. This is a game called Darfur is Dying. It's an older game now. I think it's, 10, 12 years old, that looked at the crisis in Darfur. And you are seeing what's going on. And it allows just, that emotional distance where you can at one sympathize with the other, but at the same token create enough emotional distance that it puts them in a position where you can contemplate it and think about it in a way that isn't merged with yourself. And then finally, this is a game called Peacemaker, again, an older game that takes you through the basically the conflict with Israel and Palestine, looking towards a two-state solution. And this is very much like, games like Civilization or SimCity that take an omniscient perspective. You're not on the ground, you're not really even dealing with characters or people. You are looking at everything with a God's eye view. And this is the least emotional of the game modes in terms of perspective. But what's interesting is it does provoke something which is called cognitive empathy, which is a type of empathy which may not be anchored in emotion, but is also an important part of the empathy formula. And I will be discussing that shortly. If any of this interests you, I would highly recommend a book by Mary Flanagan and Helen Nissenbaum called Values at Play in Digital Games. It's really fascinating to think about not just empathy, but a whole series of values and how they manifest itself through game mechanics and different types of games. And really, it's a great read and really kind of sheds a new perspective on how games can both project values and ideologies in the ways that they actually do it. So when we break down empathy, there's sort of an anatomy of empathy. We have on one side the cognitive empathy that I was discussing, which is more of an intellectualization of the other, and the emotional empathy. And then emotional empathy can be divided into parallel empathy and into reactive empathy. So in parallel empathy, you feel what the person who you're empathizing with is feeling. So an example that I'll give you momentarily, if a mother is distraught at her endangered child, you feel distraught in parallel with the mother. A reactive empathy is when your feeling is different from the person. Somebody may be living on the street and they're okay with it, but you feel sorry for them because you feel that if you put yourself in their shoes, you wouldn't want to be living on the street. Or maybe they're not okay with it, but the feeling that they have is different than the feeling that you have, and you're reacting to them in a certain way. So that would be reactive empathy. Um, so let's start with Peacemaker. Peacemaker came out again probably about 10 or 11 years ago. It sought a two party or two-state resolution for that was the win condition. It was written about pretty extensively in that Mary Flanagan book that I mentioned earlier, where you take on the role of either the Prime Minister of Israel, the President of Palestine, and you've got to arrive at two-state solution. She encourages you to play the character that you least sympathize with. So if you're all pro-Israel, play the Palestinian side. If you're pro-Palestine, play the Israeli side in order for, to really understand the perspective of both parties. And boy, does this game really is very relevant to things that are going on today. I'll show you a quick video. I hope the sound will work because I didn't check to see if I clicked for sound. Hopefully it will. Very quickly, can somebody confirm by speaking that you can hear the sound because I can't see your faces?
We cannot hear the sound.
You cannot hear the sound. I'm glad I checked. Okay, so let me just stop sharing for a moment here, and I will reshare with, I knew it. I always forget to do this. Share. Why isn't it automatic, right? Like, come on, Zoom. Okay, so here we are. We're back in, and we will now have sound. So let me just start that going.
Peacemaker is a game in which you take the role of one of the leaders. You can take either the role of the Israeli Prime Minister or the Palestinian President. You can play both perspectives. And the idea is that as the leader, you have to react to real-time events happening in the world. You can negotiate with other leaders, but you also have security or military actions that you can take. And by doing so, you have to reach a peaceful solution while in office.
In an Israeli high school, a new computer game called Peacemaker was launched today. Children playing the role of Israeli and Palestinian leaders trying to make peace in a virtual world of suicide bombings and Israeli military strikes.
We don't expect to address all issues of the conflict. We don't expect to give all the answers. We're bringing up issues for discussion.
I think the best aspect of playing this game is that, especially if you're Palestinian student in the territories or an Israeli student within Israel, you get a chance to really feel what both sides are thinking and get a better sense of what they can do together to work towards peace.
If you look at the video game industry today, there are so many games out there about violence, about war, about destructions. We say a simple thing: there is certainly a place for one little game about peace.
Okay. So that is sort of the initial introduction to Peacemaker. It's interesting that what Ali Barak, who's actually one of the founders of the Games for Change Festival in New York, who made this game, really fascinating guy. He says more than anything else, it's an artifact to spur conversation. This isn't going to solve anything in and of itself. It might move the needle in the way some people think about things, but it's part of another way to engage the different perspectives and the different views, and hopefully a productive discussion. So the game is really interesting because, as I mentioned, it's more on the side of cognitive empathy. You're kind of you're taking the role of a leader. You're monitoring your polls. You're monitoring the other relevant leaders and groups. You're making decisions. You're monitoring your local approval ratings. So even things like that, like that you're beholden to your public. You as an individual may have an ideal of what you want to do, but you've got to take all of these different elements into consideration, and you realize that being a leader in these situations is a delicate balancing act. what is really fascinating is the counterpoint to all of these data-based decisions that you're making is that they use real news footage and newspaper articles from the conflict. And that does add an emotional element and does clearly remind us that what you're playing at here is has a real world counterpart. And I think that really makes a powerful it's a powerful way to ground the gameplay in the reality of the conflict. So here's another news piece. So they've conducted research with Pacemaker, and one of the most salient articles that I read had a group of American, Turkish, Palestinian, and Israeli students play the game, and then they measured how their beliefs or attitudes towards the conflict changed after gameplay. What I can't remember is if there were discussions or how they contextualized the gameplay, but whatever it was, they all had the same experience. So what was fascinating is there was a significant and perceptible change in attitude with the Turkish and American players. And they're a little bit more sidelined to the conflict. They're not directly impacted by the conflict. Whereas the Israeli and Palestinian players didn't really change their attitudes very much. And again, that's not surprising because when you're living the day-to-day reality of the conflict and your views have hardened, I think it'll take more than just playing a game in order to really significantly change your perspective. And it could be, how long was the game played? How long were they exposed to it? What were their pre-existing attitudes? Because even within Israel and Palestine, there's a whole range of views. There are many Israelis who don't support conflict with the Palestinians and vice versa. So what was really interesting as well was that what they found was that the knowledge that was gained through gameplay mitigated the influence of political and religious affiliations on the peace process. And this is significant because our political and religious views can have a significant impact in how we approach a conflict resolution or peace process. And there seemed to have been the knowledge and information gained through gameplay softened some of these views, which would have consequences to a peace process, which is really positive. This is a very, very small game that I discovered that was designed by students at Tracy Fullerton's program on games. I think it's at UCLA. UCLA? No, USC. I can't remember. I should know this, but I can't remember. And it takes place during the civil war in Rwanda. Many of you will know that this is one of the more horrendous conflicts between the Tutsi and the Hutu. And this is a Tutsi mother. It's a very simple mechanic. It's a very simple game. You're a Tutsi mother hiding with your child while Hutu patrols are outside murdering your fellow Tutsis. And the mechanic of the game is you are trying to pacify your child so that it doesn't cry or that she doesn't cry and draw the unwanted attention of the roving patrols. And the mechanic is these sort of letters float up on the screen in a certain rhythm, and you have to use the keyboard to match the letters. And if your rhythm is thrown off, your baby starts to cry because you've not successfully sung the lullaby that is being represented by the mechanic. And it sounds easy enough, but what's really fascinating the first couple of times you play is that while you're trying to do this, you hear these horrendous sounds and sound bites coming from the outside. You hear people begging for their lives and machine guns going off and, machetes slashing. So it's really horrendous. And so trying to have this kind of lullaby rhythm and trying to keep up with the letters while you're being disturbed by these outside sounds is really, really difficult. At first, and then, or it was for me anyway. And it was a really powerful experience, bite-sized. The whole game doesn't take more than 5 minutes to play at the most, but it really drives home an important scene from the war. So what we feel for the mother who is, we all feel anxiety for the child. We also feel anxiety for the mother. And that would be an example of parallel empathy. But then, the child is crying, but the child is crying because it's probably hungry or tired or fussy, has no idea that it's in danger. So the empathy we feel for the child's safety is a reactive empathy because it doesn't parallel the child's own feelings. I mean, we're not crying and screaming. And obviously, what I want to really emphasize here is our moment of empathy is very, very distant from the lived reality of a scene like this, right? I mean, we can't compare being at home with our computers and having a touching moment or a powerful moment with the absolute horror of being in these circumstances. So, next example is an incredible game called This War of Mine. It was developed by a Polish studio and has since become required reading in the Polish curriculum. All schools are given copies and kids are made to play this game. And essentially, it's a game that's based on, it doesn't explicitly say it, but it's based on the siege of Sarajevo in the 90s. And you play the role of survivors, non-combatants who are trying to kind of stay alive while this conflict rages outside. And one of the things is you cannot go outside of your shelter during the day because there's snipers everywhere and you would be, in danger of being killed by sniper fire. So you can only have these nighttime excursions. And there's a lot more to be said, but we'll watch the video and we'll talk about it after.
For soldiers, war is about victory. For us, it was about getting food. I lived through hell with these people. We were a group. We would do anything to stay alive. I will never forget those days. Things you see in war stay with you forever.
A kiedy przyjdzie także po mnie zegarmistrz światła purpurowy, by mi zawełtać w ręki w głowie, to będę jasny i gotowy.
So, beautiful game, dark but really nicely rendered. There's a quote by Elizabeth Thoma, a researcher who wrote about this game, that is, "This war of mine is a saddening and profound experience of war, famine, murder, suicide, and failure, bringing the player closer to its victims, which are similar to them, thus having the potential for becoming a counter pedagogy of war." So again, this is all of this screams empathy, really understanding the conflicts that these people find themselves in. And what's really interesting is that there's an added dimension to this, which are what are called ethical dilemmas. And the ethical structure that we enjoy in peacetime is really challenged in a situation of conflict where you're really left to make very bad decisions or very difficult decisions. And the game has some really interesting mechanics. Like you have to go out and survive, but food is very scarce. Depending on the choices that you make, one of your characters may become depressed. And if they become depressed, you can't actually use them. They just kind of sit on their bed and they don't respond to your clicks for a certain amount of time. So that's really a very powerful mechanic. And I've never encountered that in another game. But then you have a situation like, for example, a mother and a son come to your door and they are looking for shelter and food. And so you know that if you let them in, there isn't even enough food for the people who are already living in the shelter. And so you have to turn them away. And no, you know, under normal circumstances, you see a mother and child, you're likely to say, no, come in, of course you can eat. But it's an us or them mentality where you have your kind of responsibility to the people that you're already with, and you can't take somebody else on in the process. And the game is full of these very difficult decisions that allow us to really think more deeply about the kinds of circumstances that people find themselves in a conflict. Because sometimes, if you don't really have the right context, it's easy to judge about things that you hear or things that you read about. And I think this game takes us one step closer to genuinely understanding the absolutely horrendous situation. And it's really different because when we're playing war games and, you know, Call of Duty or so on and so forth, we're very much kind of shooting and enjoying the pleasure of battle. But this is the opposite. This is like what's going on in those houses that we're passing, and what's going on to the people that are not wanting to be part of this conflict and are suffering the consequences of it. So ethical awareness, which is what's sort of drawn from these, from contemplating the complex ethical decisions that the players have to make in these games, is to critically examine or change one's own ethical values and examine the implications of one's own behavior for the lives of others. And so what this occasions is contemplation of our own ethical structures and ethics as a whole in a way, in a medium where actions have consequence, where you make decisions and those decisions have consequences, and you are one step closer to embodying the decision maker, because it's not like you're passively reading about this in a book or watching it in a movie. You are making the decisions and living with the consequences of your decisions, which is much more lifelike and realistic. So, which leads us to 1979 Revolution Black Friday. I think this game's a bit of a masterpiece. It takes place, again, very relevant to today. It takes place during the revolution in Iran, which installed the theocratic regime, which has persisted to this day. It was created by Naveed Kansari and his team. Naveed's family was from Iran. His family was affected by the revolution. They ended up emigrating to Canada. He now runs an amazing studio in New York called Ink Stories. And he created this game to really explore the complexity of this conflict, because it wasn't very black and white. During this kind of period of turmoil where the Shah of Iran was usurped, there were all kinds of competing political interests, and eventually the theocratic regime rose to take control. And so the game really explores it through a historical lens, but also through a documentary lens, because much of the game uses real footage, real pictures, and in many ways it's an interactive documentary, which I find a really fascinating genre that the game world should, I think, further explore. So let's watch the trailer and we'll talk a bit more about it.
In a clear voice for the machine, give us all the information about your collaborators and the details of your next target.
This is the future of Iran. You see why I told you to save your film? This is incredible.
My part is taking pictures, not choosing sides.
Listen, you may not realize it, but you're gonna have to pick a side, okay? You may not want to, but it's gonna happen.
For the side that has to win.
Don't do this, Reza.
Reza, they'll take you to Evi. Where is Ali? This is not a game.
I don't trust this punk with his camera. Don't do this, Reza. Reza, take care of him.
Imprisoned and executed for our beliefs. Do you still have the rolls of film from the pictures you took today?
I don't have to justify my actions to you. Get him a new ID.
Look up, I'm just a photographer, that's all.
You and your stupid camera.
I'm your family, Hussein.
Get off! Who did this to me?
You know what to do, Reza John.
It's about survival in this country, betcha. Every detail, Reza.
So really kind of exciting and incredible game. So one thing I failed to mention about this War of Mine 2 is that it uses all modes of empathy, right? It has the cognitive empathy, parallel, reactive, and then adds the element of ethical awareness. So I've staggered the games in such a way that each one layers on a new element, which is productive to the aims of peace, education, and conflict resolution. And this one is sort of the grand finale where it has it has the reactive empathy, it has parallel empathy, it has opportunities for cognitive empathy. Much like this War of Mine, you have to make really, really difficult decisions in this game. And those decisions were drawn from interviews that Naveed Kansari and his team had with, 40 people that lived through the conflict. And you are just faced, there's games that kind of give you the good side, bad side, good and evil type decision trees, whereas this is just all bad. Like sometimes there's no good decision. You just have to make a decision and live with it. And I think that's more true to life. And similar to this War of Mine, this game adds that element. So you have that kind of critical ethical element, but it also adds an element, which I'm going to discuss in a second, of intercultural understanding. So as I mentioned, it's all from the perspective of a young photographer who's returned home on the eve of this, very pivotal and turbulent period in his country's history, and he's navigating, the streets and his friends and trying to figure out where he stands with everything. And you are confronted with, different options. And here you have a violent and non-violent option, which seems black and white, that it's not at all if you were to understand the context that you find yourself in. And the results are not what you think. Sometimes throwing the rock was probably the better thing to do because life is messy and these kind of hard and fast rules that we live by don't always apply when things can get a little bit messy. As I mentioned, there's an enormous amount of documentary elements, whether it's, audio tapes of the Shah's speeches, family pictures that are woven into the game, historical footage. It's really clever that they're seamlessly included in the game. And then there's a menu where you can actually access more information. Really, really brilliant. And one thing that is pervasive is you really understand you don't understand Iranian culture. You're exposed to Persian culture. And what's interesting about that is that Iran can become a headline, right? It's this distant place where conflicts are born and conflicts are carried out. They're certainly dominating our headlines these days. And I think most people are sufficiently well informed to know that the actions of the government can be separated from the actions of the people. But that's not always the case. And what this game does is it takes you into the dining rooms and the living rooms, and it's scattered with Farsi words, and you see the food that they eat and some of the culture. And what that does is it humanizes what otherwise might be a dehumanization of the other, right? Iran is this monolithic, it's a word, it's a concept, and we forget about that there's all kinds of nuances and lived experiences. And this game does a very good job of reminding us of that, which is another important element in sort of drawing people together, which is intercultural understanding, which is described as a pillar of the peace education process as it promotes respect for different cultures and helps students appreciate the diversity of the human community. And as I said earlier, you can that process of understanding is even further deepened by the unintrusive menu where you can go in and find out more. And this, from a game perspective, is really smart because sometimes when you're playing, you don't want to be bombarded with unnecessary information, but it could provoke curiosity, and your curiosity can be nourished by this additional material. And what then, going back to something I sort of alluded to earlier, is there's a difference in spectatorship, because when we spectate, we all watch the news, or we have watched the news, we watch documentaries, we feel maybe sympathy, maybe sadness, maybe anger in those moments. But let's face it, it's not much different than any other form of entertainment. How much of those feelings actually lead to action? How much do we feel complicit in what we're watching, right? Because we almost see it as another thing happening to other people. We fail to see how we participate in the problem and how we might be part of the solution. And media has its own way of inscribing behaviors. I'm a McLuhanite. I love Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message. And so in many ways, what I would call spectatorial media, television, film, even reading to some degree, creates a distance which allows us, which solicits emotion to be sure, but does it solicit action? So there's a school of thought, there's still a lot of research to be done in this area, that the interactivity, engaging with the medium, having your actions produce consequences. Having agency within the medium creates a greater opportunity for complicity if contextualized in the right way. And this is the big one, is that you can play any of these games and get nothing out of it. Not change your behaviors, not think more deeply about the problem. And as somebody who thinks a lot about training and education through the lens of games, or games through the lens of training and education, context is crucial. They don't stand alone. Somebody can play a game and access the ludic system underneath it and just play to win, and not really contemplate or reflect on the greater, significance of the game or what that game can push you towards thinking. There are many ways to interpret a text, and a game is a text. So if you have a certain outcome that you're looking for from a game, it's important to direct your audiences or your students or whoever to that particular outcome, because like as I said earlier, players can ignore the content to beat the game. So there are different strategies of contextualization. One of them is priming, where you actually, if you want them to think more empathetically, or you want them to focus on a certain idea in the game, you discuss it in advance, you share relevant material in advance so that they enter, or you enter the game with that perspective in mind. The supplementary material, sort of what 1979 Revolution does within the game itself, where it gives you supplementary material, but you can also provide that yourself or expose yourself to it. So you read more about the Iranian conflict, you read more about the siege of Sarajevo, or watch a film, or watch a documentary and learn more about it, and that can shape the experience. And of course, one of the most powerful ways to create context is simply through guided discussions and talking, whether online forums or in person or whatever the case may be. And I think about this stuff a lot through the lens of education. And finally, what's really important too is media literacy. Because if we're accessing these elements through games, what are the affordances and constraints of games? Like thinking about how we are accessing the information and what the medium does to mutate that information, and how we internalize that in a way that is relevant to the medium. So it's really important to understand and be critical of all media and how they shape discourse by their unique constraints and affordances. And so I'll end with, when you look deeply into your anger, you will see that the person you call your enemy is also suffering. That's a really powerful concept. As soon as you see that, the capacity of accepting and having compassion for them is there. So that's words to live by, right? To remember that, maybe our anger is masking us from seeing a deeper reality. And that could both ease our burden and ease the world's burden if we were to act on these words. So that is all that I have for today. I'll stop sharing. And
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. Let's see what.
words.
Yes, it did. We have a couple of questions here, but please relay your questions in the chat. Scott had the question at the beginning of the presentation. It might be referring to your work when he asked when in Mainz. If you understand the question, yes, please respond.
Yeah, so it's we are in Mainz on June 18th and 19th. June 18th and 19th. It's going to be fun. We're right on the Rhine River. There's a wine festival. So hopefully if you are in Germany in that time, you can pop by and have a blast. It's going to be an amazing event.
Excellent. And then Kara popped into my chat and asked if you will all have access to the recording. The recordings are uploaded on the Goose YouTube channel. So to revisit Paul's wonderful presentation, please navigate to the Goose YouTube channel to rewatch it. At the moment, we do not have any additional questions, so I'm going to give a couple of just a minute or two to our participants to type something in the chat.
Nice to see the little hearts floating up. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you for the kind words. It's funny, I in my classes, you don't get that many questions, and I always want, I love questions. Love to be interrogated.
Absolutely. I don't know that you receive as many compliments though.
No,
So,
not always. No, no, they're a pretty reserved bunch. So yeah.
Umar asks, could you share any video game around global issues like climate change,
Yeah,
vis-a-vis the developed versus the developing world?
yeah. That's it. That's the second part of that developed versus developing world. Is would be harder. Nothing comes to mind right off the bat. I have so many games floating out in my head that like to pinpoint one. There's a game called Eco, which is kind of a world building game that forces you to balance forces you to balance different factors in order to create an eco-friendly society. But what I can tell you is there are a lot of games out there that are tackling climate change and ecological issues. It's a huge, in fact, there's a really wonderful kind of Bible that was put out by a special interest group that is the Bible for how to develop environmental games or games that support environmentalism and eco-friendly games. And so it really would be just a matter of doing some research. And it's always hard to keep up, there's literally thousands of games coming out every year. But they're certainly out there, and a little bit of research, I'm sure you can pull out some gems, especially with the more specific elements of your ask. Thanks, Umar.
Follow-up from Umar. What is your key insight after looking at all these games? Does gaming shift the needle on views?
Yeah, I think shift the needle for sure. Are we going to solve all of our world's problems through games? I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think that our human nature is such that it takes more than games. But the word game is loaded, right? It's if you go down the rabbit hole of defining game, you're going to realize that it's very loose. In fact, I think it was like Wittgenstein or somebody used the word game as his launch pad to discuss how language is ambiguous and tricky. So I like to think about interactivity. Games teach us a lot about being interactive, and I do feel that as I mentioned in the presentation, that interactivity certainly has a way of engaging our minds and maybe our emotions in a way that is so powerful that I think it can help alter behaviors. But at the same token, I'm also somebody who believes that really it's the systems that have the biggest power over people's behaviors. And if we don't change systems, I feel that all of these amount to band-aid solutions. So if nothing else, at least I would say that we are now living in a participatory culture in an interactive world, and this would be the most relevant medium to the times that we're living in, especially with young people. So you have a much better chance of engaging a young person with an issue through a game than you would necessarily through a book or even a film. So I don't think there's a magic bullet here, but I do think it is one of the most relevant ways to address some of these issues.
From Cyril, is it implied here that a classical war game, say a Napoleonic war game on a board, would be less capable of enticing empathy? If so, is it because the participants are abstracted into counters and numbers rather than explicit imagery, or for some other reason?
Yeah, I that's a great question. So I have no evidence to back this up at all, right? But it's one of those things where the more the less work the medium is doing for you, the more work is going on in your head. And this is a very blunt force answer in the sense that I do feel that at least intellectually a board game can engage you in a level where you have to kind of fill in the blanks more in your head. However, what's really powerful about video games is that they're grand operas of media. Like they have text and music and sound and visuals. And there's a richness to that, which I think can be very emotionally evocative. So in some ways, my instincts would say that board games might be very powerful tools for cognitive empathy, for strategic thinking, and all that type of stuff. Whereas maybe the digital games can, increase the emotional richness because you're not all, it's very rare to play a video game and cry, for example, or feel very moved. You're usually just excited or frustrated. But it's a really great question.
I've definitely teared up as I was losing a game, so I will push back against the
Okay, there you
crying.
go. There you go. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Um,
Um,
Sorry, Paul. Umar asked another question. So he specifies that he's a gamer based in Pakistan and is looking forward to hosting
mhm.
America and Iran. In a fantasy scenario, what game would you recommend to delegates of both countries on the way to the negotiating table?
What an awesome question. Like I wish I had I wish I had an hour to think about this because it would have to be really tricky. Like I think that because they're all playing a game, right? They like lives, I don't know if lives mean the same thing to politicians that are operating nationally than they do to us on the ground. Like I think, what is it? Like one death is a tragedy and a million deaths are a statistic. So I think that they're operating on that level where these are all just pieces on a board and to really duplicate that, I think that the game would have to be a game that would really kind of play out the consequences of where things are going. Like, what is the world going to look like with artificial intelligence and drones and these conflicts that are flaring up all over the planet? What is the end game? Are we going to be, a few billionaires living in these citadels while the rest of us are, sort of scavenging, or what? Where's it all going to go? And I don't know. Again, the more kind of pragmatic side of me goes, is there even a game that could shift it, right? Because they are playing the ultimate game as it is, and I think they're happy to play the way that they're playing, I think. But I love the question. I would really I'm gonna be thinking about that one for a while and thinking what would be the game that I would get them to play. Thank you.
I have a question myself, Paul.
Sure.
In answering one of the first couple of questions you mentioned, how you mentioned the interactive element of gaming. And so, how do you respond to the societal concerns that diminish the interactive aspect of gaming because it is constrained to the virtual realm and it cannot be extrapolated to human interactions?
Yeah, I mean, but it is human. Most games now are human to human mitigated through a virtual environment, right? So on one hand, these often we're like okay with watching TV for endless amounts of time, but you put the kids in front of a game and all of a sudden, it becomes much more, objectionable. But I feel that, listen, we cannot our face-to-face human interactions are the product of millions of years of evolution. There are nuances there that are not going to be replaced with a mitigated environment. However, what I do feel is we're getting closer to that reality through interactive engagement that we were with passive spectatorial engagement. So it is an evolution in the right direction. And I think I think that popular notions of games are hung over. Like the idea of the solitary gamer in his basement is just wrong, right? What I see, like for example, when I see middle schoolers playing Minecraft, Minecraft is a lot of opportunity for conflict, right? You build something and somebody else blows it up, and what you see is groups of kids develop protocols. They resolve their conflicts in the game to respect each other and work together. And in many ways, what they're rehearsing is successful collaboration in the future through this interactive realm, much like we might have in the backyard or playing tag. So that part of it continues to persist in a way that if they're all sitting at home watching their individual TV shows, they're not rehearsing those interactive opportunities, those opportunities for socialization. Do they replace face-to-face socialization? Absolutely not, right? But again, referring to my friend Marshall McLuhan, we have to like it's not about the world we want to live in, right? Where we return to only face-to-face interactions. I think it's the world that we have to deal with now. This is the world that we're dealing with. And there's still a possibility that we will, dissolve some of those barriers over time with augmented reality, where we're going to be it'll be a perfect blend of the digital and the physical, and we'll regain more physical contact, but through the enhancements of digital interfaces. So, but I do feel that diminishing interactivity and positing it, with physical interactions is really just kind of not realistic in the world that we're living in.
Thank you, Paul. Do we have any questions, any additional questions for Paul here? I'll give it another minute, and then if there are no additional questions, we'll wrap it up. All right, well, it looks like we've exhausted our audience's questions. So thank you once again, Paul, for the wonderful presentation and for taking the time out of your day to provide us your insights. All of our participants also complimented my gratitude with their earlier comments, and I thank you all for attending this Goose webinar and for your questions. And I look forward to welcoming you all to our next webinar. All right. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Sophia. It was a huge pleasure, and I'm happy to have been here today. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.